What's up everyone? In this video, I'm going to be editing your photos in Lightroom. I hope it'll help to see my process when editing photos, and maybe you'll learn a tip or two along the way. If you want to see me edit some of your photos, leave a comment with links below to download raw photos or get in touch with the contact form at newlayer.com. Let's get started. So this first image is by Jerome Palos, and it's a pretty cool urban cityscape taken in San Francisco. And what I like about this is the lights on the bridge and that big kind of cigar-shaped building with all the lights on the top in the background. Kind of gives me a futuristic vibe, so that's what I'm going to go for with this edit. So the first thing that I want to do is straighten this out, and I can see there's some lines in the sidewalk here. So I'm going to increase the exposure by a lot just so I can see those better. And then I'm going to come and click on the crop tool and click on the angle tool and draw a straight line. Then I'll set the exposure back to 0 and we can really get started. So since I want to focus kind of on the lights of the bridge and that one building in the background, I'm going to change the crop on this from horizontal to vertical. So I'm going to choose my crop tool and I'm going to grab the corner here and change this to a vertical crop. And then I'll drag that over. Somewhere right about there looks good, I think. I might tweak that later. And with a nighttime cityscape like this, I usually like to go a little bluer. So I'm going to bring the temperature down just a little bit. Somewhere around there. It's not a huge difference, but just a little bit. And then I'm going to come down to the highlights and bring that down. Somewhere around -25, and that'll kind of just get rid of any blown out highlights. And then I'll increase the shadows just a bit. I don't want to go too far here because I like the contrast in night images like this, so I'm going to leave it to about +20. And then I'm going to stretch out the dynamic range a bit. So I'm going to bring the whites up. Then back down, maybe somewhere 45 or 50. And then I'll take the blacks down. -25 or so is good. Now I'll come down and I'm going to increase the texture just a bit, maybe +15 to 20. And then I usually don't take the clarity slider up very high, but it works really well for night shots like this. So I'll probably take it up quite a bit. So not quite to 100, I'm going to back off. Somewhere around 65 is good. And then one thing I noticed about this image are these little lens flares, and I kind of like those. They kind of go with the rest of the image. So one trick that I've learned is that if you take the dehaze slider to a negative value, it usually makes lens flares stand out even more. So I'm going to try that. And I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm going to take it way to the left. But bringing that dehaze slider down has made some of the stars stand out, so that's pretty cool. So I'm going to leave that at about -35 or so. Now I kind of want to introduce my own colors into this image, so I'm going to come down to the saturation and take that down to about -20 just to take some color out of it. And after the basic panel, I almost always go down to my effects panel and work on my vignette. So I'm going to give this a subtle vignette. I'll take it down, I don't know, -15 or so. And I usually bring the feather up somewhere between 50 and 100. In this case, I'm going to go all the way to 100. And that'll just make it so it's a nice even fade from the corners to the center of the image. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the calibration panel and play with some of these sliders and see if I can get any interesting color combinations. So first I'll slide the red primary hue left and right and kind of see what that gives me. Kind of like that orange color that it gives towards the right, but I don't want it to be so strong, so I'm going to set it to about 25. And then I'll do the same with the green. Again, I like it to the left over here, so I'm going to set that to about -25. And then I'll do the same with the blue. I'm really not going for purple, so I'm pretty sure I'll stick to the left. So I really like that teal color, but again, I don't want it to be quite as strong. So -25 or so is good. Now I want this image to be more blue and less orange, so I'm going to come over to the HSL panel. And down under the saturation, I'm going to bring the oranges down. Maybe -25 or so. And I'm going to come down to the blues and bring that up, because that's really what I want to highlight in this image. So 50 or so is good. Now I also want this to be a little more red and teal, so I'm going to come up to the hue. And I'm going to change the oranges and shift those towards red. -50 looks pretty good. And for the blues, I'm going to move those towards teal. So not quite as far, but maybe -25 or so. So I'm going to close that, and next I'm going to go into the split toning panel. And here's a tip that I learned recently. If you didn't already know, if you hold down Alt while you're dragging some of the sliders in Lightroom, different effects pop up to kind of help you visualize what you're changing. Normally I used to increase the saturation of these in the split toning panel before changing my hue, but I've learned that if you hold Alt and change the hue, it'll automatically and temporarily set the saturation to 100. That way you can see what color you're working with without having to do extra work. So I really want this image to have a nice blue look, so I'm going to go to about 195. And once I like that color, I'll start bringing the saturation up, somewhere around 35. And another trick that I do sometimes is to set the shadows and the highlights at the same color, because that way that color mostly affects just the shadows and highlights and leaves some of the midtones alone. It just gives a different look than just changing the temperature of the image. So I'm going to set the hue to about the same, 195 or so. And then I'll bring the saturation up probably to about the same level, 35 or so. And then play with the balance slider to see what I like. If I have the balance up a little higher, it gives me a little more of those red tones on that building, so I'm going to leave it about 75. So I think that's pretty much it for this image. It looks a lot more cyberpunk or urban now, and I think that matches this image better. You can find more images by Jerome Palos on Instagram, @Jerome Palos. Alright, so next is a photo by a photographer named Vladimir Elle. You can find more of his images on Instagram, @VovanOrel, and I'll put links to all of these people's Instagram in the description. So this portrait is really cool. You gotta love how the freckles and the sand kind of go together really well. So the first thing that I notice about this, and I see this a lot in images, the cropping is kind of technically correct, but so what I mean by that is if you look at this arm and how close it is to the edge of the frame, this one's pretty much the same. But to me, these heads look like they're shifted over to the right, so I'm going to change the crop a bit. So I'm just going to crop it over to the right until I feel like the heads are centered, and then maybe shift it up a bit. So it might be a slight change, but to me that just looks a lot better. It looks more centered. And it might not be perfect, but I think it's better than before. So since this was taken on the beach, I want to warm it up a bit, but it still kind of looks cold and wet, so not too much. Just enough to kind of make the skin tones look a little more lively. So first I'm going to go into the basic panel and I'm going to increase the temperature. Somewhere around 7800. Then I'll come down to the highlights and bring those down. And what I'm doing with the highlights and shadows is kind of creating a more flat image for a bigger dynamic range, and then I'll adjust the whites and blacks to spread that out. Now I'll bring the shadows up. Somewhere around 65 or 70 is good. And then, like I said earlier, I'm going to bring the whites up to around 40, and then I'll take the blacks down. About -15 looks good. I do this trick a lot on portraits, and it will kind of help the faces stand out without making it look too obvious. So I'm going to create a radial filter, and I'm going to make one on each of the faces. Now, normally I set these at about 1/3 of a stop, but I think I can go a little higher. Maybe somewhere around 0.45. And that doesn't look super obvious, but it definitely brings more attention to the faces. And I have some stuff in mind for the tone curve that I think will kind of even that out even more. Another thing that I do is brush on the eyes to brighten those up. So I'm going to create a new adjustment brush, and I'm going to paint just on the eyes here. And the only thing that I'm changing is having the exposure increased by about 1/3 of a stop. So that just adds a little more life into this image as well. Now I do like how kind of dark and grungy this image is, so I'm going to bring the exposure down just a bit, somewhere about around -0.25. And then I'll come down to my presence area and increase the texture, about +15, and then play with the clarity a little bit. I think somewhere around 35 looks good. And then I typically add a little dehaze, usually somewhere between 5 and 10, so I'll leave that at about +5. Again, my next stop is going to the effects panel and seeing if I like a vignette. So I think somewhere around -10 is good, and then again I'm going to increase the feather to about 100. Next I'm going to go into the calibration panel and play with these hue sliders again. I don't really like how either of those look, so I'm going to leave that one alone and try the green one. Kind of like how this looks on the left, but just a little bit, so I'm going to leave that about -10 or so. And then lastly, the blue hue slider. I definitely don't want it to look green, so I'm going to go the other way. And I really like that color that it brings into the skin there. So I'm going to set that to about -20 or so. Now I'll go back into my split toning panel, and holding Alt, I'm going to adjust the hue until I find a color that I like. And 60 looks really good on that skin. And then I'll increase the saturation until I find the amount that I like. So just a little bit, maybe 10 or 15. And then I'll do the same with the shadows. I want this to have more of a traditional split tone, so I'm going to go with the blue. Somewhere around, I like that teal, so I'm going to go with around 200. And I'll bring that saturation up, maybe around 20. And then again, play with the balance till I find something I like. 65 looks good. Like I mentioned earlier, I kind of had this idea in mind that I was going to flatten out this image a little bit with the tone curve. So I'll bring the bottom left point up just a little bit, and I'll take the top right point down. And then I'm going to put these points in the middle kind of back where they would be if this curve was straight. I'm going to bring this down just a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. It's kind of a high fashion type looking photo, so thanks again to Vladimir. So next we have this cool photo from Emmanuel Armenta, and I don't have an Instagram for him, so Emmanuel, if you're watching, hit me up and I'll add a link in the description. So I really like this picture. It's got a really European look to it, which is cool. The people who live in this area probably kind of find it boring, but different is exciting, and I live out in a rural area, so that's probably part of why I like it so much. Now, the focus to me is kind of on the train car and the tracks and maybe even the woman in the foreground, so I'm going to crop this one vertically too. And that's pretty rare. I usually don't like changing the crop so much, but I just think it suits these images. So I'm going to come to my crop tool and drag from the corner here. And I think that's pretty good. I might adjust this a little bit. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I might change that a little bit. Now, obviously the ground is wet, so I want to give this kind of a cold and wet feeling. So first I'm going to come into my basic panel and change the temperature a bit. Around 4200 looks good. And then I'll bring the highlights down just a little and increase the shadows. And then I'll bring up the whites and bring down the blacks. So I'll set the whites to about 50 and bring the blacks down somewhere around -25. Now, kind of just like with nighttime photography, increasing the texture and clarity a little more than usual usually makes these photos look pretty good. So I'm going to increase the texture about 20 and the clarity to about, I don't know, 40 or so. And then I'll bring the dehaze up to make it a little more contrasty. Same thing with the dehaze. On a wet, cold environment, it usually makes it look more interesting. And when it's rainy, I usually feel like colors just get a little more drab, so I'm going to bring the saturation down. Maybe -35 or so, so it's pretty gray. And again, I'm going to go into my effects panel and work on the vignette. So I'm going to give this one a stronger vignette, maybe -20. And again, bring the feathering up to about 100. Now I'll go into my calibration panel and play with these hue sliders. I kind of like that purplish color that this red hue slider adds, so I'm going to set that to about 25. I don't really care either way on the green, so I'm going to leave that set at 0, and then I'll play with the blue. And I really like that teal color. And when it's wet, I feel like you can go a little stronger on these colors, so I'm going to set it to about -50. And to me that looks pretty good. I don't really want to do anything else. That one was a little easier, it just took some contrast adjusting and some cooling down. But I think that nails the cold and wet feeling pretty well. This next photo was sent in by Robert Campsmith from Michigan. He doesn't have a social media account to share, but I thought this image had some potential, so I wanted to edit it anyways. So from what I'm told, this was like a really super cold and windy day, which seems to be a theme in a lot of these photos so far, but again, I'm going to try to give it more of that feeling. So I'll again start in the basic panel and bring the temperature down. Just a little bit, maybe about 5600 or so. And to me this looks pretty purple, so I'm going to bring that magenta down to about -4 or so. Now it is kind of dark and stormy, but I want it to be properly exposed before I work on it, so I'm going to bring the exposure up just a bit. Somewhere around 0.85 or so. And then I'll work on the highlights and shadows. So I'll set the highlights to about -35 or so. And the shadows don't need a whole lot of work, maybe 25. And then I'll increase the whites. I usually don't like to go over 65, so I'm going to leave it about there. And then I'm going to bring the blacks down. About -50 is good. There's a lot of detail in the sand and the waves, so I'm not going to play with the texture, but I will increase the clarity. And again, when it's wet and stormy, I usually go a little higher on the clarity. So somewhere around 75. And usually ocean scenes or scenes with a lot of clouds benefit a lot from dehaze, so I'm going to bring that up a little farther. Around 20 looks good. And again, I'm going to come down and desaturate this quite a bit. -50 or so, because I'm going to add in some of my own colors. Now I'll go down to the effects panel and set the vignette. And this is a really easy way to make it look dark and stormy without darkening the whole image. So I'll set the amount to about -25 and the feather to 100. And I want the vignette to reach in a little bit farther from the edges, so I'm going to bring the midpoint down to about 25. Now, if you haven't noticed already, I almost always go to the calibration panel and play with these sliders to see if I can find any cool colors. So first I work on the red, and going to the left kind of takes all the color out of it, so I like going to the right on this one. I'll set that to about 30 or so. And I like that purple color that going to the left on the green introduces. So just a little bit, -5. And going to the right on the blue is really purple and green, so I'm going to go the other way. And that gives us that nice reddish and teal color. So somewhere around -25. And I want to accentuate that red and teal, so I'm going to go into the HSL. And I'm going to change the hue for the orange and take that over to the left. Just a tiny bit, maybe -7. And then same thing with the blues, I'll take that to the left. Just a little bit. -10 or so. And then to really accentuate those colors, I'll bring the saturation on the orange and the blue up. So I'll take the saturation of the orange up to about 40 and take the blues up to about 25. Next I'll go into the split toning panel and let's hold Alt and change the hue and see what looks good. I think somewhere around 50 is pretty good, and then I'll increase the saturation just a little bit. I don't want to warm this image up too much. So around 10 looks good. And then same thing for the shadows, but I want to go with the teal or blue color. So 195 or so, and then I'll bring that saturation up. Somewhere around 20. And then play with the balance till I'm happy. Somewhere around 50 looks pretty good. One thing I notice is that the top of this image is super bright, and I want it to look more stormy, so I'm going to come over and choose my graduated filter, and I'm going to draw that over the sky here. And I'm just going to bring the exposure down just a little bit, maybe 1/3 of a stop. And when you do that, sometimes you get a little color shift, and I want that to match the blue of the rest of the sky. So I'm going to bring the temperature down on that. -8 or so. And then like I said, using dehaze can make clouds look really good, so I'm going to play with that too. Obviously that's way too much, so I'm going to bring that back. Somewhere around 22. And I'm going to take some of the saturation out of that even more. -7. And that just makes the sky look a lot more stormy to me. So that looks pretty good to me. It definitely gives the feeling of inclement weather, which is what I was going for. But this one was similar to some of the others, so let's finish with something different. This last portrait is by Fatah Gulen, and I really like the brushed metal type look on this train. I like how the interior is kind of a different color temperature than the outside, so I'm going to play with that. So first I'm going to crop it a little bit tighter so we get more of her face. And again, I'm going to come to the basic panel and play with the temperature. I think it needs to be just a little bit cooler, 2600 or so. And there's a lot of magenta in this image, so I'm going to bring that down. Maybe -10 or so. And that makes the train a little green, but I like the color of the interior lights, so I'll see if I can fix the rest of that later. I'll bring the highlights down just a little bit. And on this one, especially because she's wearing black, I'll probably have to bring the shadows up quite a bit. Somewhere around 50. And then I'll increase the whites to about 60 and bring down the blacks. So I'm going to bring in some radial filters to kind of bring more attention to this model. So the first one that I'm going to add is on the whole body here. And I'm going to have the exposure on that one set to 1/3 of a stop. And I'm going to warm it up just a bit so the skin tones look a little more natural. Then I'm going to kind of do the same thing but just on her face. And I don't think I need to add any warmth to that. I think that looks pretty good. And again for the eyes, I'm going to get my brush tool and paint just on the eyes and brighten those by increasing the exposure by 1/3 of a stop or so. So let's see where texture gets us. I kind of like how grungy this image is, so I'm going to increase the texture a lot. Somewhere around 60, and then I'll increase the clarity. This I'm not going to do so much, maybe 15. So the texture slider lets you add some texture and grunge to your image without the kind of obvious clarity slider look that's so popular. I'll bring the dehaze up just a bit. And again, bring the saturation down just to get rid of some of that green in the train car. So -25. Now we'll go to the effects panel and work on the vignette. And then play with the feathering. Somewhere around 75 on this one. And then again, back into the calibration panel. I like the orange look that this gives the skin, so 20 or so on the red. And going to the left on the green primary gives kind of a really strong split tone look, so I'm going to use that. But more subtle, so maybe -10, -15. And then I really like how that looks going to the left on the blue. So I'm going to do about -25 or so. Now I want more teal and less blue, so I'm going to go into the HSL and change the hue of the blues over to the left to get more teal. -30. And then I like how the red lips stand out, and there's a little red in this American flag, so I'm going to increase the saturation of the red. Somewhere around 35. And then to bring a lot more life back into the skin tones, I'm going to increase the saturation of the orange. Somewhere around 45 or 50 looks good. And then to really make that teal pop and give a complementary color to the skin, I'm going to increase the blues. 35 looks good to me. And then on this image, I think it would benefit from a little change to the tone curve. So I'm going to bring that bottom left point up a bit and the top right point down. I like how that looks. And then I'll put a point down here and one here and maybe play with that to bring some contrast back. And I think that looks pretty good. It's really beautiful, but it's still got that grungy feel to it. That's it for now, guys. If you liked this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe. Also, leave a comment down below and let me know which edit was your favorite. And again, if you want to see me edit your photos, make sure to leave a comment below with download links and I'll check those out. I'm JT Shaver for New Layer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.